I stood in the kitchen, my hands trembling as I gripped the counter. Ethan's words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. "Sam, there's something you need to know about my mother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face my husband, searching his eyes for a clue. We'd been married for 8 years, and I thought I knew everything about his family. Clearly, I was wrong. "What is it, Ethan?" I asked, my heart racing. He took a deep breath. "Mom. She was involved in a scandalous affair years ago. It tore the family apart. My Uncle George hasn't spoken to her since." I felt the blood drain from my face. "An affair? But your father, Dash." "It wasn't with Dad," Ethan interrupted, his eyes downcast. "It was with George's wife." The room spun. I steadied myself against the counter, trying to process this bombshell. "Why are you telling me this now?" Ethan's shoulders slumped. "Because Mom called today. She's asking to move in with us." My jaw dropped. "Move in? Ethan, we can't dash." "Please, Sam," he pleaded, reaching for my hand. "She has nowhere else to go. I know it's a lot to ask, but she's still my mother." I closed my eyes, thinking of our daughter Ellie sleeping upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in our kitchen. When I opened them again, Ethan was staring at me, his face a mixture of hope and desperation. "Okay," I heard myself say, even as alarm bells rang in my head. "She can move in. But Ethan, we need to set some ground rules." He nodded eagerly, relief washing over his features. "Of course, anything you want." As Ethan pulled me into a hug, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made a terrible mistake. Little did I know, inviting Vivian into our home would be the beginning of a nightmare I never saw coming. "Thank you, Samantha. I never thought I'd be living with my family again," Vivian said, her eyes glistening as she stood in our living room, surrounded by boxes. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. "We're happy to have you, Vivian." The first few days were surprisingly pleasant. Vivian helped with dishes, played with Ellie, and even complimented my cooking. I started to think maybe I'd misjudged her. One evening, as I was tucking Ellie into bed, Vivian knocked softly on the door. "May I join you?" she asked. I nodded, and she sat on the edge of the bed. To my amazement, she began to sing a lullaby, her voice soft and melodious. Ellie's eyes grew heavy, and soon she was fast asleep. "That was beautiful," I whispered as we left the room. Vivian's eyes misted over. "I used to sing that to Ethan when he was little. I've missed these moments so much." For the first time, I saw vulnerability in her. Maybe this arrangement could work after all. The next morning, I found Vivian in the kitchen, making pancakes. "I thought I'd surprise everyone," she said with a smile. As we ate breakfast together, laughing at Ellie's syrup-covered face, I felt a warmth spreading through me. This was what family should be like. But just as I was letting my guard down, I noticed something odd. Vivian kept steering the conversation towards Ethan's childhood, telling stories that subtly highlighted her sacrifices and devotion. "Remember when I nursed you through that terrible flu, Ethan?" she said, patting his hand. I didn't sleep for days. I saw Ethan's expression change, a mix of guilt and discomfort crossing his face. "Yes, Mom," he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. As I cleared the dishes, a chill ran down my spine. Was I imagining things? Or was Vivian trying to remind Ethan of his loyalty to her? And if so, what did that mean for our family? I shook off the thought, determined to stay positive. But as I watched Vivian fuss over Ethan and Ellie, I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath her sweet exterior, something more calculated was at play. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of Vivian's subtle manipulation, setting the stage for the storm that was about to engulf our once peaceful home. "Samantha, could you please redo this?" "It's not quite right," Vivian said, handing back the folded laundry. I blinked, staring at the perfectly folded towels. "What's wrong with them?" "Oh, nothing major. It's just, I prefer them folded in thirds, not halves. It's a small thing, really." I bit my tongue and redid the entire basket. It was just laundry after all. No need to make a fuss. But as the days passed, Vivian's small things multiplied. The dishes weren't clean enough. The living room needed rearranging. Ellie's hair wasn't brushed properly. One afternoon, I overheard Vivian talking to Ellie in the kitchen. "Sweetie, why don't I make you a snack? Mommy's cooking isn't always the healthiest, you know." My cheeks burned. I'd spent months perfecting nutritious meals that Ellie would actually eat. That evening, I tried to talk to Ethan. "Han, I think your mom might be overstepping a bit." He frowned. "What do you mean? She's just trying to help." "I know, but Sam," he interrupted. "She's been through a lot. Can't we cut her some slack?" I nodded, swallowing my frustration. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next day, I was helping Ellie with her homework when Vivian swooped in. "Oh, darling, that's not how you do it. Let Grandma show you the right way." I watched, stunned, as she erased Ellie's work and started over. "Vivian," I said, my voice tight. "Ellie's teacher specifically asked for it to be done this way." She waved her hand dismissively. "Teachers these days don't know what they're doing. Trust me, I know best." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about laundry or cooking or homework. Vivian was systematically undermining me in my own home. As I watched her coddle Ellie and whisper something that made my daughter giggle, a chill ran down my spine. I had invited a wolf into our den, and now I had to figure out how to protect my family without tearing it apart. "Why are you so selfish, Samantha? Can't you see I need help?" Vivian's voice was sharp and accusatory. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. I'd just returned from a grueling day at work, only to find Vivian waiting for me, arms crossed. "I'm sorry, Vivian. What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The house is a mess. Ellie's toys everywhere. And don't get me started on dinner." I glanced around. The house looked fine to me. Better than usual, actually. "I appreciate you watching Ellie, but Appreciate?" she scoffed. "I'm not a babysitter, Samantha. I'm family. Or have you forgotten that?" The accusation stung. I'd bent over backwards to accommodate Vivian, but it was never enough. "Of course not. I just Just what? Too busy with your career to care about your family." That was the last straw. "That's not fair," I said, my voice rising. "I work hard to provide for this family." "Well, maybe if you were home more, things wouldn't be falling apart," Vivian snapped. I opened my mouth to retort, but Ethan walked in. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between us. Vivian's demeanor changed instantly. "Oh, nothing, dear. Just a little misunderstanding." I stared at her, incredulous. "Ethan, your mother is probably just tired," Ethan interrupted. "Mom, why don't you rest? Sam and I can handle dinner." As Vivian retreated, looking every bit the martyr, I turned to Ethan. "We need to talk about this." But he shook his head. "Not now, Sam. Let's just have a peaceful evening, okay?" That night, as Ethan slept beside me, I lay awake, my mind racing. Vivian's behavior was getting worse, and Ethan seemed blind to it. I felt alone, trapped in my own home. With a sudden clarity, I realized I needed proof. Ethan wouldn't believe me without evidence. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and found my old journal. From now on, I'd document every interaction with Vivian. As I wrote down the day's events, a plan began to form. I'd gather evidence, build my case, and when the time was right, I'd confront both Vivian and Ethan with the truth. Little did I know, this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change our lives forever. "You need to leave this house right now," Vivian screamed, her face contorted with rage. I stood there, stunned, as rain pelted the kitchen window. The day had started like any other, but it had quickly spiraled into a nightmare. Earlier, I'd prepared dinner as usual. Vivian had taken one bite and immediately accused me of trying to poison her. "What did you put in this?" she'd shrieked, spitting out the food. "It's just chicken curry, Vivian," I'd replied, bewildered. "The same recipe I always use." But she wouldn't listen. She'd ranted about how I was trying to get rid of her, how I'd never accepted her. Ethan, who'd been working late, wasn't there to mediate. Now, As Vivian continued her tirade, something in me snapped. "This is my house," I said, my voice low and steady. "You can't tell me to leave. Your house." Vivian laughed bitterly. "This is my son's house. You're just the woman he married." The words stung, but I stood my ground. "Ethan and I built this life together. You're a guest here, Vivian." Her eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." She stormed past me, slamming the front door behind her. I sighed with relief, thinking the worst was over. But moments later, I heard the click of a lock. Confused, I tried the door. It wouldn't budge. "Vivian," I called out. "What are you doing?" "Teaching you a lesson," came her muffled reply. "Let's see how you like being locked out." Panic set in as I realized what was happening. My phone was inside. Ellie was at a sleepover, and Ethan wouldn't be home for hours. The rain was coming down harder now, and I was dressed only in a thin blouse and jeans. As the cold seeped into my bones, I knew I had to find help. I stumbled down the street, the wind whipping around me. That's when I heard it, a faint cry for help. Following the sound, I found an elderly woman lying on the sidewalk, her leg bent at an odd angle. "Please," she gasped. I fell. "I can't get up." Despite my own predicament, I couldn't leave her there. "I'm Sam," I said, kneeling beside her. "What's your name?" "Helen," she replied, her eyes filled with pain and gratitude. As I helped Helen and called for an ambulance using her phone, I made a decision. This situation with Vivian couldn't continue. For the sake of my family, for my own sanity, I had to take action. Little did I know, this moment of crisis would lead to revelations that would change everything. "Sam, are you okay?" Ethan's voice was filled with panic as he found me drenched and shivering. I could barely speak, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. Beside me, Helen groaned in pain, her legs still at an awkward angle. "Ethan," I managed to stammer. "Your mother." She locked me out. His face paled. "What? No, that can't be right. You must be confused." Before I could argue, paramedics arrived, whisking Helen and me to the hospital. As they treated me for hypothermia, I overheard Helen talking to a nurse. Always been that way, even when she was younger. Poor Vivian, so desperate for control. I turned my head weakly. "You know Vivian?" Helen's eyes widened in recognition. "Oh my, you're Ethan's wife, aren't you?" I should have realized. Just then, Ethan burst into the room. "Sam, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." I cut him off. "Ethan, there's something you need to see." With shaking hands, I reached for my phone and pulled up the journal entries I'd been keeping. As he read, his face cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally devastation. "I can't believe she'd do this. All this time I thought, it's not your fault," I said softly. "She manipulated all of us." Helen cleared her throat. "If I may, I've known your mother for years. This behavior, it's not new. She did the same thing to your father and to George." Ethan's head snapped up. "Uncle George? What do you mean?" "Hindsight. The affair. It wasn't what you were told. George tried to protect your father from Vivian's manipulations. She twisted the story to isolate your father and you." The room fell silent as the weight of this revelation sank in. Ethan slumped into a chair, his face in his hands. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up, his eyes filled with a determination I hadn't seen in months. "We confront her. Together. This ends now." As we prepared to leave the hospital, my phone buzzed with a message from our neighbor. "Vivian just left your house with Ellie. Said you asked her to pick her up from the sleepover. Is everything okay?" My blood ran cold. Vivian had our daughter. Ethan and I exchanged a panicked look. This was no longer just about us. Our family's future hung in the balance, and we had to act fast. "You think you can just take over our lives?" My voice was steady but full of resolve as we burst through the front door. Vivian stood in our living room, Ellie clutching her hand. The sight of my daughter made my heart race. "Ellie, come here, sweetie," I called, trying to keep my voice calm. "Mommy!" Ellie's voice wavered, confusion evident in her eyes. Vivian tightened her grip on Ellie's hand. Now, Samantha. Let's not make a scene in front of the child. Ethan stepped forward, his face a mask of anger and determination. Mother, this ends now. We know everything. Vivian's facade cracked for a moment before she regained her composure. I don't know what you're talking about, dear. I was just taking care of Ellie while you two were indisposed. Stop lying. I snapped. We know about the affair, about Uncle George, about everything. At the mention of George, Vivian's eyes widened. Who told you? It was that meddling Helen, wasn't it? Ethan moved closer, his voice low and dangerous. It doesn't matter who told us. What matters is that you've been manipulating us for years. You locked Sam out in a storm. You could have killed her. Vivian's grip on Ellie loosened, and I seized the opportunity to scoop up my daughter. As I held Ellie close, Vivian's mask finally shattered. You don't understand, she wailed. I did it all for you, Ethan. To protect you, to keep our family together. By tearing it apart, Ethan's voice cracked with emotion. By hurting the people I love? Just then there was a knock at the door. Ethan opened it to reveal a man I'd never seen before, but whose features were hauntingly familiar. Uncle George. Ethan gasped. Vivian stumbled back as if she'd seen a ghost. No, you can't be here. You'll ruin everything. George stepped inside, his eyes sad but determined. It's time for the truth, Vivian. All of it. As George began to speak, revealing years of secrets and lies, I felt the weight of our family's history pressing down on us. Ellie whimpered in my arms, and I realized that this moment would shape not just our lives, but hers as well. The truth was finally coming to light, but at what cost? As I looked at Ethan's devastated face and Vivian's crumbling facade, I wondered if our family could ever truly heal from this reckoning. As long as I'm alive, I will live, Helen said, her eyes full of gratitude as she sat across from me in our newly peaceful living room. It had been 3 weeks since the confrontation with Vivian. The day after Uncle George's revelations, Ethan and I had asked her to leave. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The look of defeat in Vivian's eyes as she packed her bags would haunt me for years to come. You know, Sam, Helen continued, what you've been through, it's not just about surviving. It's about thriving despite the challenges.
I nodded, thinking about the roller coaster of emotions we'd experienced. Ethan had been quiet lately, processing the truth about his mother and rebuilding his relationship with Uncle George. Ellie, perceptive as ever, seemed to sense the shift in our family dynamic and had become more affectionate than usual. I never thought I'd say this, I admitted, but in a way I'm grateful for what happened. It forced us to confront the truth and make changes. Helen reached out and squeezed my hand. That's the spirit, dear. Life will always throw curveballs, but it's how we handle them that defines us. As if on cue, Ethan walked in, a small smile on his face. Uncle George just called. He's coming for dinner next week. I felt a warmth spread through my chest. This was what family should be: supportive, honest, and loving. You know, Ethan said, sitting beside me, I've been thinking about the future. About growing old together and the kind of grandparents we want to be for Ellie's children someday. I leaned into him, feeling the strength of our bond. We'll be the kind that listens, that supports without smothering, that loves unconditionally. Helen beamed at us. Now that's something to look forward to. Remember, every day is a gift. Make the most of it. As Helen left that evening, I stood on the porch, watching the sunset. The future stretched out before us, full of possibilities. We had weathered the storm and come out stronger. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we'd face them together, with honesty, love, and the wisdom we'd gained from this ordeal. Turning back to the house, I smiled. It was time to start our new chapter, one filled with hope, understanding, and the unbreakable bonds of true family.